December 19, 1944, Verdun, France, 11:00 a.m. The room is heavy with cold and crisis. Around a simple wooden map table, the fate of the Western Front hangs in a haze of cigarette smoke and condensed breath. Outside, a freezing European winter grips the city. Inside the third-floor conference room of a former French barracks, the chill is psychological. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stands, his usual grin absent. To his left, the calm, analytical face of Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder. To his right, the worried eyes of General Omar Bradley, whose 12th Army Group is being ripped apart. And opposite them, a figure seemingly carved from a different granite, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. His jaw is set. His polished helmet liner rests on the table beside him, twin ivory-handled pistols at his hips. The map before them is a catastrophe. A thick, menacing red arrow, representing the German offensive, pushes deep into the Allied line, creating a massive, vulnerable bulge. Communications are shattered. Units are surrounded. Panic is a tangible scent in the air. Eisenhower's voice cuts the silence. He poses a single, monumental question to the only general in the room who seems unshaken. "George," he says, his eyes locked on the map, "when can you attack?" Patton doesn't hesitate. He doesn't consult notes. On December 22nd, he states, flat, absolute. A murmur ripples through the staff officers. 3 days. It is a logistical impossibility. His Third Army is currently engaged, facing east. To attack the Bulge, he must disengage, turn his entire force 90 degrees north, and march over 100 miles into a blizzard. He is either bluffing, or he has already set the wheels in motion. The tension in the room crystallizes. This is no longer a planning session. It is a wager, with the entire Allied campaign in Europe as the stakes. By the autumn of 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had lost its triumphant summer rhythm. The headlong pursuit of a shattered German army after the breakout from Normandy had ground to an exhausted halt at the gates of Germany itself. Supply lines, stretched over 400 miles from the Normandy beaches, were at a breaking point. The Red Ball Express, a legendary convoy system, was burning out men and trucks in a desperate effort to keep frontline units fueled. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, had to be hauled across a war-torn continent. At the same time, German resistance had undergone a terrifying metamorphosis. The battered, disorganized formations of August had been stiffened by fresh, if often young and old, conscripts, and were now fighting from the formidable fortifications of the Siegfried Line. The West Wall, the weather turned. Rain, then sleet, then snow. Thick cloud cover grounded the Allied air forces, the flying artillery, upon which ground commanders had come to rely. The war became a brutal, yard-by-yard slog in freezing mud. On a map, the front line resembled a ragged scar from the Swiss border to the North Sea. In the north, British and Canadian forces were bloodied in the inferno of Operation Market Garden and the grinding push to clear the Scheldt estuary. In the center, the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies hammered at the Ardennes Forest, a meat grinder of dense woods, mines, and prepared killing zones that consumed divisions. And in the south, Patton's U.S. Third Army, after a spectacular dash across France, was engaged in bitter fighting to reduce the fortress city of Metz. This was the brittle reality, an overextended Allied force, dependent on a single major port, Antwerp, which was only just becoming operational. Commanders felt the operational pause was inevitable, a necessary regrouping before the final push across the Rhine in the spring. They saw their own exhaustion, but dangerously underestimated the enemy's capacity for resurrection. While Allied intelligence noted a steady buildup of German forces opposite the Ardennes, a quiet, mountainous, and lightly held sector, it was dismissed. The assessment was logical but fatally flawed. The Ardennes was where Germany had struck in 1940, a masterstroke of surprise. To do it again, in winter, with weakened forces, seemed an absurdity. A calculated risk was taken. The 85-mile front was held by only 4 divisions of the U.S. 1st Army, 2 of them green, 1 battered from Verdun, and 1, the 99th, seeing its first action. It was deemed a quiet zone, a place for recuperation. In the deep, camouflaged forests east of that serene front, under a blanket of radio silence and meticulous deception, a phantom army was coalescing. Hitler's final, desperate roll of the dice was already in motion. In the dank concrete of the Adolf Hitler, the Eagle's Nest, command complex near Bad Nauheim, the plan was born from a mind divorced from military reality but clinging to symbolic resonance. To Adolf Hitler, the Ardennes was not just a weakly held front, it was a portal to lost glory. His objective was not a simple tactical victory, it was Antwerp. Seizing the Allies' sole major supply port would, in his vision, slice the British 21st Army Group from the American forces, trigger a political crisis among the Allies, and buy Germany the time and leverage to negotiate a peace in the West. It was an operational fantasy, but one he would force into existence with sheer will. The resources he marshaled for Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, were the last vital breath of the Wehrmacht. Over 200,000 men, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, and most critically, some 1,000 tanks and assault guns were secretly concentrated. This included the entirety of the 6th Panzer Army, spearheaded by the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and the 5th Panzer Army. These were not the paper formations filling the rest of the line. They were the final strategic reserve, painstakingly hoarded through the autumn defeats, equipped with the best of Germany's remaining armor, King Tiger tanks, Jagdpanthers, and New Panther Orff G models. Their crews were veterans. Their commanders, like SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper, were ruthless and fanatical. To cloak this monumental assembly, the Germans executed a masterclass in deception. Radio traffic was mimicked far to the north. Movement was strictly nocturnal. New formations were given misleading designations. The Luftwaffe, largely absent from the skies, was forbidden from flying reconnaissance over its own build-up areas. Even the officers who would lead the attack were kept in the dark until the final hours. The Allies' formidable intelligence apparatus, ultra-intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and resistance reports was effectively blinded by weather, silence, and preconceived notions. The prevailing belief at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, was clear. The Wehrmacht was incapable of major offensive action. Then the weather gods conspired with Berlin. A forecast of prolonged, dense fog and low cloud cover settled over the region. It would ground the Allied air forces completely. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the quiet of the Schnee-Eifel forest vanished in a cataclysm of fire. A rolling artillery barrage from over 1,600 guns erupted along an 80-mile front, targeting command posts, artillery batteries, and communication nodes. In its wake, under the eerie, artificial moonlight of searchlights reflecting off the clouds, German infantry and grenadiers in white winter camouflage advanced. They moved through the mist like ghosts, infiltrating between confused American strongpoints. For the raw American troops of the 99th and 106th Divisions, it was a descent into a frozen hell, the roar of unseen tanks, the sudden appearance of enemy skirmishers from all directions, the terrifying shriek of the new Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, screaming memes. The front did not so much bend as shatter in critical sectors. Paper's Kampfgruppe, an armored spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army, began its ruthless drive west, its orders to reach the Meuse River at any cost. To the south, the 5th Panzer Army found even greater success against the 28th Division, a veteran unit still bleeding from Huichen. Roads became choked with retreating American traffic and terrified Belgian refugees. A profound crisis was metastasizing, and in its center, the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, where 7 hardtop roads converged, was quickly becoming the linchpin of the entire battle. The news that reached a disbelieving Allied high command was fragmentary, contradictory, and apocalyptic. The Bulge had been torn open, and in the chaos, all eyes turned south to the one man who had spoken of this very contingency. While others saw a quiet sector, George Patton saw a vacuum, and he understood that nature and war abhor a vacuum. His obsession was not with static lines, but with enemy capabilities and intentions. As early as November 25, he had dictated a memo to his staff, The First Army is making a terrible mistake in leaving the VII Corps static. It is highly probable that the Germans are building up east of them. He had even ordered his G2, Colonel Oscar Koch, to prepare a contingency plan for a sudden, massive counterattack northward. This was not clairvoyance. It was a ruthless application of military principle. Patton studied the same maps, the same intelligence summaries as his peers, but he filtered them through the mindset of an aggressive opponent. He assumed the enemy would strike where he was not expected, and with whatever force he could muster. Consequently, even as Third Army fought eastward toward the Saar, Patton had secretly instructed his staff to prepare 3 separate operational plans for swinging his entire army into a new axis of advance. The groundwork for the legendary pivot was not laid in the Verdun meeting. It was laid in the war games and staff drills of November, when the Ardennes was still serene. His mind was already moving north while his tanks faced east. The force that erupted from the Ardennes Forest was a paradoxical creature, tactically brilliant, operationally flawed, and strategically bankrupt. Its strength lay in its initial violence and the quality of its armored spearheads. Men like Paper were given simple, brutal orders: drive west, ignore flanks, bypass resistance, do not stop. This tactical ferocity, however, was shackled to Hitler's delusional operational goals. The road network of the Ardennes was sparse and fragile. Funneling 2 panzer armies down a handful of icy, winding lanes created monumental traffic jams, panzerstaus, that strangled momentum. The plan relied on capturing Allied fuel dumps intact, a gamble that largely failed, leaving the advanced panzers starving for gasoline. Furthermore, the infantry divisions following the armored points were often of poor quality, unable to quickly reduce stubborn American strongpoints that now blocked crucial supply routes. The offensive was a spectacular, sharp knife thrust into flesh, but the hand behind it lacked the strength to twist it or the reserve to keep pushing. It was the last coordinated gasp of the German military, a force burning its final reserves of fuel, equipment, and the hardened veterans who could operate them, all for a mirage. The failure to foresee the offensive stands as one of the great intelligence puzzles of the war. It was not a lack of information, but a failure of interpretation, a collective paralysis of imagination. Ultra, the priceless code-breaking operation, had provided warnings, signals about panzer divisions being withdrawn for refitting, mentions of new formations like the 6th Panzer Army. But these were filtered through a dominant, logical consensus. The Germans were preparing a stubborn defense of the Rhine. The idea of a major offensive was deemed strategically irrational. Aerial reconnaissance was hamstrung by weeks of solid overcast. Reports from the front line of increased vehicle sounds and patrol contacts were explained away as local reliefs or defensive preparations. The very quiet of the Ardennes was read as evidence of weakness, not of a predator holding its breath. The most damning evidence came from the enemy himself. Captured soldiers from the build-up phase spoke of a big attack coming. These warnings, rising from the mud and snow, were dismissed by higher echelons as the exaggerations of frightened men or enemy deception. The Allied High Command was looking directly at the gathering storm, but its analytical lens was calibrated for a different kind of weather entirely. While Patton provided the will and the direction, the pivot was made possible by an organism of staggering complexity, the Third Army's logistical and operational machinery. This was not a simple matter of turning tanks on a road. It was the orchestrated movement of over 250,000 men, 50,000 vehicles, and countless tons of supplies across a 90-degree arc in winter, while actively disengaging from a hostile enemy. The plan, pre-drafted by Koch and Patton's brilliant chief of staff, General Hobart Hapgay, treated divisions like modular components. Telephone lines were rerouted. Supply dumps were pre-positioned along the new northern axis. Entire truck companies, the famous Red Ball convoys, were retasked overnight. Artillery battalions performed a carefully choreographed dance. One battalion would remain firing to mask the sound of another displacing. Unit commanders were given march tables with precise timings, routes, and phase lines. This was a testament to American industrial staff work, the unsung backbone of combat power. The pivot was a victory of organization and gasoline as much as of courage and tanks. It proved that an army's true mobility is not measured by the top speed of its Sherman, but by the flexibility of its entire support structure to reinvent itself under fire. For the common American soldier in the path of the offensive, the battle was stripped of grand strategy. It was a visceral, chaotic fight for survival against two enemies, a ruthless German foe and a brutal winter. Cut off, surrounded, or simply holding isolated road junctions, small units fought with a desperate tenacity that formed the critical anvil upon which the German spearheads shattered. At places like Lanzerath Ridge, the twin villages of Krinkel-Trocherath, and the siege of Bastogne, the American response defied German expectations. They did not break and run as in 1940. Engineers turned into infantry. Cooks and clerks formed makeshift platoons. Isolated tank destroyer crews set up ambushes in woods, exploiting the limited sightlines to kill far heavier German tanks. The cold was a constant, grinding agony, causing more casualties than bullets in some units. Yet this very terrain and weather that enabled the German surprise also worked against them. The narrow, icy roads channeled their armor into perfect killing zones for American anti-tank teams. The stubborn defense of key crossroads, like the one at St. Vith by the 7th Armored Division, created massive traffic jams that bled momentum from the attack. The German soldier fought for a fading Reich. The American GI, often bewildered and afraid, fought for the man next to him and the ground he stood on. Their stubborn, unplanned resistance bought the time the High Command desperately needed. At the SHAEF headquarters in Versailles, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced his gravest crisis. The offensive threatened to unravel 5 months of costly advance. His calm, consensus-building leadership was now tested by fire. His first and most critical decision was psychological, to treat the breakthrough not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he told his staff. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. This set the tone. His next decision was strategic. He recognized the front was bifurcated. General Bradley, on the southern side of the Bulge, could no longer effectively command the northern forces. With Bradley's reluctant agreement, Eisenhower placed Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in temporary command of all U.S. 1st and 9th Armies north of the Bulge, a politically fraught but militarily sound move to stabilize the defense. Finally, he had to choose the counterstroke. He possessed one uncommitted strategic reserve, the XVI Airborne Corps. He flung it into the breach at Bastogne and St. Vith, and he had one aggressive commander with a plan already in motion, George Patton. The Verdun meeting on the 19th was not a planning session. It was Eisenhower's ratification of a desperate gamble and his empowerment of the only tool sharp and swift enough to execute it. He bet the campaign on Patton's preparedness. The drive to Verdun on the morning of December 19th was a journey through a world unraveling. George Patton, riding in his staff car, had already set his mind in motion. At 5:45 a.m. that day, before departing his headquarters in Nancy, he had summoned his corps commanders. His orders were not if, but how and when. To Major General Manton Eddy of XII Corps and Major General Troy Middleton of VII Corps, he outlined the bare bones of the northward turn. He gave them their initial objectives, their lines of march. The machinery of Third Army was already, audaciously, beginning to engage its new gears before the command to do so had been given from above. Patton was not going to a meeting to get permission. He was going to a meeting to announce a reality he was creating. The atmosphere in the Verdun conference room was thick with the smoke of anxiety. Eisenhower, Bradley, General Jacob Devers, Air Chief Marshal Tedder, and a host of senior staff faced a map that depicted a hemorrhage. The red crayon marking the German penetration was a wound deep in the Allied flank. Reports, few and grim, spoke of broken units, captured headquarters, and relentless enemy pressure. The priority was no longer the Rhine, it was survival, stabilization. Eisenhower, his face grave, laid out the stark situation. He then turned to the solution. Calmly, he addressed the room, but his focus was on the one man whose energy seemed to vibrate against the despair. "George," he said, the word cutting through the low murmur, "I want you to command this move under Brad's supervision. When can you attack?" The historical record notes a slight variation in the exact phrasing, but the essence remains. The Supreme Commander was handing the counterpunch to his most volatile fighter. Patton did not blink. On December 22nd, he said, with 3 divisions. A ripple of disbelief, even annoyance, went through some present. Bradley would later write he thought it was patent nonsense. To commit to a major counteroffensive, to reorient an entire army in just 72 hours in this weather against a raging offensive seemed the height of professional bravado. It defied all textbook timelines. But Patton was not bluffing. He laid it out crisp and clear. The 4th Armored Division would pivot from the Saar, leading the thrust. The 80th and 26th Infantry Divisions would follow. They would attack toward the besieged crossroads of Bastogne. It was a focused, violent solution to a chaotic problem, relieve the pressure by relieving Bastogne. Eisenhower challenged him, "Don't be fatuous, George. If you try to go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready and you'll go piecemeal." He argued for a stronger, later attack on the 23rd or 24th. Patton, unshaken, insisted, "I'll attack on the 22nd. I'll guarantee success." The gamble was sealed. Eisenhower, in that moment, made a supreme commander's choice, to trust in the aggressive certainty of one subordinate over the prudent caution of conventional wisdom. He gave Patton the order. The Third Army was now officially unleashed to execute the turn it had already begun. As the meeting broke, Patton paused only to call his Chief of Staff, General Gay. His words were simple, a conductor confirming the downbeat. "The conference is over, get everything rolling, we attack on the 22nd. The race against time, weather, and a desperate enemy was now all that mattered. The following 72 hours became a legendary feat of military movement. Across a front of nearly 100 miles, the Third Army performed its violent ballet. It was not a simple left turn. It was a disengagement, a redeployment, and an attack, all conducted simultaneously in the face of an enemy still pressing its own offensive. The pivot began in the iron twilight of December 19th. On muddy secondary roads and icy forest tracks, long columns of vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, artillery pieces began to snake northward. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by the aggressive Major General Hugh Gaffey, was the spearhead. Its combat commands had to extract themselves from frontline positions facing east, refuel, rearm, and set off on a complex series of marches. Their route was a logistical nightmare. A single main road, Route N4, was the artery. Military police worked in freezing sleet to manage the torrent of traffic. Tank retrievers stood by to haul vehicles that slid into ditches. Engineers labored to strengthen bridges for the constant weight of Shermans and tank destroyers. Further south, the infantry divisions of III and XII Corps began their own arduous trek. The 26th Yankee Division and the 80th Blue Ridge Division marched in trucks and on foot, their soldiers packed together for warmth, rifles between their knees, staring out at the bleak, winter-shrouded landscape of Lorraine transforming into the more rugged hills of Luxembourg. There was no secrecy. The Germans knew a major force was moving. But the speed at which it was happening, and the sheer audacity of its redirection, confounded their expectations. Patton's presence was a physical force multiplier. He seemed to be everywhere, at a clogged crossroads bellowing at a traffic control MP, in a dank farmhouse briefing a regimental commander, on the hood of his jeep studying a map as snow gathered on his shoulders. He pushed, cajoled, and inspired. He understood that momentum was not just a tactical principle, but a psychological weapon. His order was blunt: drive like hell. On December 21st, as the columns ground forward, the weather, their greatest enemy, turned catastrophic. A new storm front moved in, bringing blinding snow and temperatures that plunged well below freezing. Visibility dropped to zero. Roads became sheets of ice. The march slowed to a crawl, but it did not stop. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division were completely surrounded. The German ultimatum for surrender, delivered on December 22nd, was met with the famously terse one-word reply from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe: "Nuts." The situation inside the perimeter grew more desperate by the hour. Medical supplies dwindled. Artillery ammunition was rationed. But the defenders held, bending but not breaking, forming the anvil. At dawn on December 22nd, as promised, the 4th Armored Division's lead combat command crossed the line of departure and attacked north. They immediately met ferocious resistance. This was not a breakthrough into open country. It was a brutal, grinding advance against dug-in German Volksjäger and Panzergrenadiers who understood the vital ground they held. The attack bogged down in the deep snow and thick woods south of Bastogne. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. For 2 days, it seemed Patton's guarantee might fail, shattered against the winter and a determined enemy. But the pressure was relentless. The 26th and 80th Divisions entered the fight on the flanks, widening the assault and straining German defenses. Then on December 23rd, the weather broke. For the first time in a week, the skies cleared. A thunderous roar filled the air as waves of Allied fighters and fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, swept overhead. They strafed German columns, bombed strongpoints, and broke up armored counterattacks. The flying artillery was back. On Christmas Day, the 4th Armored, bloodied but unbowed, renewed its assault with concentrated fury. Combat Command R, under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, led the final push. In a series of sharp, violent actions, his tanks and armored infantry battalions clawed their way forward. At 4:45 p.m. on December 26th, a spearhead of the 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Charles Bulge, made contact with outposts of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion of the 101st, just south of the Bastogne perimeter. The corridor was open, the siege was relieved, the pivot was complete. Patton had done the impossible. He had turned an army of 250,000 men 90 degrees in 3 days and struck the enemy flank with decisive force. The strategic initiative in the Battle of the Bulge had just been wrenched from German hands. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the battle, it was the end of the German dream. With the corridor pierced, the crisis of containment was over. The Allied posture shifted irrevocably from desperate defense to methodical, overwhelming counter-offensive. The Battle of the Bulge now entered its most grueling phase, the elimination of the salient itself. Patton's Third Army became the southern jaw of a massive vice. From the north, the U.S. First Army, now under Courtney Hodges, with Montgomery overseeing the broader northern sector, began its own powerful thrusts downward. The objective was no longer just to stop the Germans, but to trap them. The towns that had been overrun in the first chaotic days, Saint-Vith, La Roche-en-Ardennes, Houffalize, became objectives to be retaken in bitter, house-to-house fighting. The weather closed in again, returning to freezing fog and snow, grounding the air forces and making every advance a trial. For the German army inside the Bulge, the reality was now one of catastrophic attrition and slow strangulation. Their spearheads, which had reached within sight of the Meuse River at Celles, were now cut off, their tanks abandoned for lack of fuel. The 2nd Panzer and Panzer-Lehr divisions were shattered in the process. The order from Hitler was rigid and fatal: no retreat. Hold position at all costs. This directive transformed the Bulge from a failed breakthrough into a killing ground for his last mobile reserves. German units, low on ammunition, gasoline, and food, fought with a desperate skill from frozen foxholes and forest bunkers, but they were being compressed from 3 sides. The Allied advance was systematic and merciless. It was a battle of artillery. Massive, serenade, bombardments by hundreds of guns would precede infantry attacks. Tank destroyers provided direct fire support against fortified positions. The landscape itself was a shattered testament to the violence. Forests reduced to matchsticks, villages pulverized into gray rubble, roads littered with the blackened hulks of German and American armor, frozen corpses in field gray and olive drab, half buried in the snow. By mid-January 1945, the vice was tightening around the neck of the salient. Patton's III Corps and the First Army's VII Corps converged on the key road junction of Houffalize. On January 16, patrols from the 2nd Armored Division, 1st Army, and the 11th Armored Division, 3rd Army made contact. The Bulge was officially cut. The remaining German forces were now in a frantic, disorganized retreat back to the Siegfried Line, abandoning mountains of equipment. They left behind a frozen wasteland and a broken army. The human cost was staggering. American casualties exceeded 80,000, including approximately 19,000 killed. British losses added another 1,400. For the Germans, the disaster was even more complete. Estimates of their losses range between 80,000 and 100,000 men, including killed, wounded, and captured. Critically, they had lost nearly 800 tanks and assault guns and over 1,000 aircraft, irreplaceable resources squandered in a gamble that had failed. The experienced Waffen-SS panzer divisions that formed the spearhead were hollowed out, their veteran cadre gone. The Wehrmacht in the West was now a phantom of its former self, capable only of a stiff, doomed defense. The true impact of the Ardennes offensive and its decisive counterstroke transcended the brutal arithmetic of casualties and captured ground. It triggered a fundamental and irreversible shift in the strategic and psychological landscape of the war in the West. For Germany, the Battle of the Bulge was a catastrophic feint in force that broke its own army. It had sacrificed its final strategic reserve, the very resource needed to contest the Rhine crossing, in a vain offensive. The elite 6th Panzer Army, intended as the defender of the fatherland, was now a crippled remnant. The material losses in tanks, vehicles, artillery, and aircraft were a deathblow to the already reeling German war economy. Morale, which had briefly soared with the initial breakthrough, collapsed into cynicism and despair. For the German soldier retreating eastward in January 1945, the war was now visibly and undeniably lost. The defensive victories they would later fight on German soil were a protracted coda to a symphony already concluded in the snows of the Ardennes. Hitler's gamble had not only failed, but had accelerated his own doom, clearing the path for the final Allied invasion of Germany itself. For the Western Allies, the victory was hard-won but total. The crisis forged a hardened, combat-tested confidence. The initial intelligence failure was scrutinized and lessons were learned, but the performance of the frontline troops and the command response, particularly the flexibility and speed demonstrated by Patton's Third Army, became a template for the rest of the campaign. Eisenhower's leadership under pressure was solidified. The friction between British and American commands, exacerbated by Montgomery's temporary command and his controversial press conference suggesting he had saved the situation, left a political scar, but militarily, the coalition had weathered its greatest internal storm. The most profound shift was one of momentum. Before December 16, the Allied advance was stalled, a slow grind against a defensive wall. After January 25, the German front in the West was brittle, drained of mobile reserves, and ripe for the taking. The road to the Rhine was open. The success of the pivot and the subsequent reduction of the Bulge directly enabled Operation Lumberjack and Operation Undertone in March 1945, the rapid drives that would vault the Allies across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. The forces that did so were the very armies tempered in the Ardennes: Hodges' 1st, Patton's 3rd, and Simpson's 9th. For George S. Patton, the pivot cemented his legacy. It transformed his image from that of a brilliant but reckless cavalryman into that of a master of operational art. He had demonstrated an unparalleled ability to think ahead of the enemy, to maneuver a large army with stunning speed, and to inject violent momentum at the critical point. The 90-degree turn entered military lexicon as the ultimate case study in operational agility. While his subsequent drive across Germany would be his final, glorious campaign, its possibility was born in the frozen roads of Luxembourg in December 1944. He had promised to attack in 3 days. He had done so, and in fulfilling that promise, he had not just relieved a besieged town, he had broken the back of Germany's last hope in the West. The Ardennes was the last, convulsive attempt by the Third Reich to dictate terms. Its failure meant the remainder of the war would be fought on its terms no longer. The initiative was now wholly and irrevocably in Allied hands. Military historians often speak of the fog of war, that pervasive uncertainty that shrouds the battlefield. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944 represents one of the thickest fogs of the modern era. Yet, within that chaos, a single, preordained pivot cut through with the clarity of a sunburst. Patton's 90-degree turn endures not merely as a feat of logistics, though it was a masterpiece of staff work and gasoline. It stands as a timeless lesson in the art of war at the operational level, the realm between grand strategy and tactical combat. It demonstrates the decisive advantage of a prepared mind. While others saw a quiet forest, Patton saw a vector for enemy action. While others planned for the spring, he wargamed for the winter. His genius was not in reacting to the crisis, but in having already conceived the solution before the crisis fully materialized. The turn was a violent application of maneuver warfare at an army group scale. It rejected the instinct to shore up the line directly in front of the blow. Instead, it struck at the shoulder of the attack, leveraging interior lines to convert a defensive catastrophe into a devastating counterstroke. It married American industrial-era staff planning with a Napoleonic-era philosophy of movement and shock. But beyond doctrine and planning, the story is anchored in human elements, the stubborn defiance of the isolated GI at countless crossroads forming the anvil, the calculated risk of a supreme commander trusting a volatile subordinate, and the desperate endurance of the soldier in the foxhole, unaware of the grand maneuver unfolding over the horizon, yet whose resilience made it all possible. The Bulge was Hitler's final, desperate bid to alter destiny. Patton's pivot was the instrument that sealed that destiny. It proved that in war, while surprise is a powerful weapon, anticipation, preparation, and the will to act with violent speed are ultimately transcendent. The roads from Bastogne did not just lead to the relief of a town. They led, inexorably, to the Rhine and to the end of the Reich. In the end, the frozen fields of the Ardennes hold a silent testament that the course of history can turn on a single, perfectly timed, 90-degree turn.